Let me take a second and ask. There are some interesting comments here in YouTube, and I want to ask. Just the first thing is, one of them says, "What I took from this is that it's an explanation for who got us to sign those trade agreements and why the world is flush with new ones, and they're trying to get nations to sign onto those." I
Yeah,
think what. Okay, go ahead. If you understand the question, I was going to rephrase it maybe.
well, the trade agreements. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the trade agreements are totally pro big corporations. They're putting big corporations in much more powerful positions. They're actually, as I understand it, and I've read some of the leaked documents, um, it gives trade agreements sovereignty over countries, and that's ridiculous. And first of all, it's always been highly suspect when huge trade agreements like TTIP and TPP are negotiated in secret. Why doesn't the American public have a right to know? Big corporations were involved in the negotiations, but you and I weren't. Consumer groups weren't, and that makes it very suspect. Those trade agreements, we also know, are based on the foundations of CAFTA and NAFTA, the Central American and North American free trade agreements that impact Mexico and all of Central America. And we've seen disastrous consequences of both NAFTA and CAFTA. Just one example, if you're looking for an easy explanation of what's wrong with these trade agreements, just one of many examples. Let's say that a big agri industry can produce a unit of corn for $5 here in the United States, a unit of corn. And it costs, but that same unit of corn can be produced by a peasant farmer in Central America for $3. However, the big agribusiness in the United States gets a $3 subsidy from the U.S. government. That means the agribusiness can sell that unit of corn in Central America for something somewhat above $2, let's say $2.50, whereas the local farmer has to sell it for more than $3. And that's exactly what's happened. The local farmer's gone out of business. The Central American countries cannot afford to give subsidies to their farmers. But because of the trade agreements, they also can't erect any kind of barriers like tariffs or taxes to bring that price up to a fair level to compensate for the subsidies that are paid in the United States. So these farmers go out of business. That's a large part of what we call the immigration problem here. Nick, you're in Texas. You're familiar with that problem. We're all familiar with that problem. Trump wants to build a wall. Well, that's not the solution. The solution is help the small farmer in Central America because we've destroyed the small farmer. They can no longer make a living off farming. They're swarming to the United States to try to get jobs here. And in the process, their land now in Central America has been basically abandoned. The big industries, the big agri industries, have now gone to Central America. They've taken over these lands legally, and they're growing flowers and broccoli, things that are not consumed in Central America, but are re-exported back to the United States for huge profits. And it's created throughout Central America a desperate labor pool. So
Hmm.
our big corporations can go down and open sweatshops and hire workers at less than the living standard because people in Central America are desperate. They're either going to flood to the United States, and that's a very dangerous route to take and very unstable, or they go to work for some big sweatshop at sub-living standard money, but at least it's something. And that's what the trade agreements have done. That and a lot more. That's just one of many examples. And if TTIP and TPP go forward, we're going to see that happen on a much larger level.
What do you say to the critics that talk about how trade is good and it creates economies of scale and it improves efficiency? The usual garbage that you hear, economists get up there and they talk about trade in this, fairy tale like way. But when you bring up the empirical data, they just kind of seem like that empirical data is just, almost like a nuisance, like it doesn't mean anything. What would you say about that?
Well, I totally agree that trade's a great thing. And I think free trade, true free trade, we ought to have true free trade agreements, which would mean that the big farmer here in the United States couldn't sell his farm in Central America. He'd have to charge more than $5 a unit. And the Central American farmer would be doing just fine there, and the North American farmer could be selling his product here if we want. But free trade would mean that you wouldn't have any of these. Not only would you not have the barriers, which these agreements usually tear down, the tariffs, et cetera, but you also wouldn't, countries like the United States wouldn't be allowed to have subsidies. That's not looked at as contrary to free trade, but it should be. So total real free trade where the playing field really is level is undoubtedly a good thing, but in my opinion it is. But that's not what these agreements are. These agreements are totally skewed in favor of big corporations. And TTIP and TPP, in fact, make a situation where if a big corporation is in any country in the world, let's say a European country under these new potential agreements, and the country passes a law that restricts the corporation's ability to make profits because it sets in place environmental laws to protect the environment of those countries or social regulations to protect workers' rights in those countries, the corporation can sue the country for implementing laws to protect its environment and its people. That's ridiculous, and that doesn't serve the interests of anyone, anywhere in the world, except the people who own the majority stock in that big corporation. It looks as though they benefit. They make money off it. But since it's creating a much more unstable world and destroying resources, tearing down an economy, participating in the death economy, it ultimately is not helping the rich people either, because we all live on this tiny, fragile space station that's got no shuttles, and even the rich people can't get off either, and we're headed for disaster. If we hit disaster, if we don't change the course, which I know we can do, but if we don't change the course, everybody's going to crash, including the very rich.